John had always been a dreamer, a man who looked at the sky and saw not just clouds or birds, but a vast reservoir of untapped energy just waiting to be harnessed. Unlike his neighbors, who were content to spend their evenings binge-watching television shows and debating the merits of the latest home decor trends, John had a radical idea. Why not use the sun's abundant power to cut down on his ever-increasing electric bills? It wasn't merely about saving money. It was a bold statement against a system that, in his eyes, had long outlived its usefulness. And so, armed with determination and an unyielding sense of righteous rebellion, John embarked on his quest to become the neighborhood's first green warrior. The process began on a bright spring morning when John, humming an upbeat tune, stood atop his creaky ladder surveying his soon-to-be rooftop masterpiece. The sleek, shiny solar panels, each meticulously aligned to capture the perfect angle of sunlight, promised not only energy efficiency but also a dramatic flare of modernity that he was sure would turn heads. His vision was grand. His modest home would soon transform into a beacon of renewable energy, a shining symbol of progress in a community that, until then, had been firmly entrenched in outdated traditions. John's excitement was infectious. His neighbor Sarah, always the first to cheer on any hint of innovation, couldn't help but burst into applause when she saw his new setup. "John, you're not just chasing the sun, you're catching it by the horns," she exclaimed, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. David and Emily, other residents known for their quirky support of anything avant-garde, joined in the chorus of admiration. They peppered John with compliments and wild predictions. Soon, not only would his roof be generating free electricity, but it might even inspire an entire wave of eco-revolution across the block. However, in the midst of all this optimism lurked an entity that John had long dreaded: the Homeowners Association, HOA. At the helm of this bureaucratic behemoth was Mike, a man whose passion for enforcing every minute regulation bordered on the absurd. Mike prided himself on maintaining neighborhood harmony through a labyrinth of rules so intricate and arbitrary that they often made little sense to anyone outside the HOA's inner circle. To him, every detail, from the color of mailboxes to the precise tilt of a garden gnome's head, required strict regulation. And so, when John's solar panels appeared on the horizon of conformity, they were seen not as a welcome step toward sustainability but as an affront to the established order. Mike's first reaction was to consult the infamous HOA rulebook, a hefty tome filled with clauses that seemed more at home in a dystopian novel than in a suburban community. It wasn't long before he discovered a clause that, while largely forgotten, stated in cryptic language that all exterior modifications must preserve the aesthetic integrity and uniformity of the neighborhood. In Mike's self-appointed mission to maintain order, this clause was the proverbial red flag, a symbol of everything that was wrong with John's rebellious endeavor. To him, those gleaming panels were not a tribute to innovation but a grotesque aberration, a flash of modernity that threatened to disrupt the quaint, monotonous beauty of his beloved neighborhood. Even before any formal complaint could be lodged, the seeds of conflict were sown. The HOA, with its cadre of self-important enforcers, began circulating memos and notices that were as pompous as they were nonsensical. One such memo, adorned with an overly decorative header and written in flowery legal jargon, declared that any unsanctioned solar installations were in direct violation of the community's established aesthetic. Its tone was less regulatory and more like a declaration of war against any hint of progress. The absurdity of it all was not lost on John, who couldn't help but smirk every time he read the memo aloud in his head. Aesthetic integrity? He mused. Since when did clean energy need to look like it's part of an art installation? As word of the impending clash spread, the neighborhood became a hotbed of anticipation. Sarah, David, and Emily rallied around John, echoing his sentiments with humorous quips and cheeky remarks about the HOA's outdated mindset. They joked that the HOA's obsession with uniformity was so extreme that even a slight change in the pattern of a doormat could trigger an emergency meeting. In these light-hearted gatherings, the community began to see John not just as a solitary rebel, but as a symbol of resistance against a stifling bureaucracy that seemed more intent on policing style than substance. Yet beneath the playful banter and the gleeful anticipation of revolution lay a darker undercurrent, a sense of impending retribution. John wasn't merely installing solar panels. He was setting the stage for a larger battle. Every screw tightened on that rooftop, every panel angled to perfection, was a small act of defiance. His mission was clear. Not only would he save on his energy bills, but he would also expose the absurdities of the HOA's iron-fisted control. It was a battle that was as much about reclaiming personal freedom as it was about championing the cause of renewable energy. In the quiet hours of the evening, as the neighborhood settled into its routine, John would often gaze at the shimmering panels under the glow of a setting sun, imagining the day when the very system meant to oppress him would crumble beneath the weight of its own ridiculousness. In his mind's eye, he pictured the very leaders of the HOA, chief among them, Mike, being forced to acknowledge the brilliance of his endeavor. It was a deliciously ironic vision, the custodians of conformity reduced to nothing more than bumbling relics in the face of a new, unstoppable force of nature. There was also a peculiar thrill in the little secrets John discovered along the way. Hidden in the dense legalese of the HOA rulebook were clauses that were so archaic and ludicrous, they provided ample fodder for his future retaliatory plans. One particularly absurd section outlined that any modification to a building's exterior that altered the reflection of sunlight was strictly forbidden, an almost comically literal interpretation of preserving aesthetic integrity. John couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. The very elements of nature he sought to harness were now being criminalized by a group of individuals who seemed to have forgotten that the sun, in all its radiant glory, cared little for human-made borders and rules. By the end of that first week, as the full impact of his solar installation began to dawn on the community, John's resolve only grew stronger. The ridicule and pompous decrees from the HOA had inadvertently lit a spark that promised to ignite a full-blown revolution. The stage was set for a clash between the old guard, represented by the outdated and humorless mandates of the HOA, and a new era of progress embodied by John's solar panels. In the grand, satirical theater of suburban life, the opening act had been played, and the audience, comprising his supportive neighbors and a few bemused onlookers, was eagerly awaiting the next twist in this unfolding drama of ingenuity versus bureaucracy. Thus, as the sun dipped below the horizon on that fateful day, John stood proudly on his porch, a silent smile playing on his lips. Just as John's solar dream began to bask in the warm glow of public support, the storm clouds of bureaucracy rolled in. It started with a seemingly innocuous memo circulated by the HOA board. A memo so laden with pompous legalese that one could only imagine it was penned by a Victorian-era barrister with a flair for dramatics. The memo declared that any unsanctioned solar installation was an unauthorized aesthetic disturbance, a phrase so absurd that it could have been lifted straight from a bad art critique. To the untrained eye, it might have read like a gentle reminder of community guidelines, but to John and his like-minded neighbors, it was nothing short of a declaration of war. At the helm of this bureaucratic blitz was Mike, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood uniformity. Mike, with his perfectly combed hair and an expression of perpetual disapproval, was determined to enforce the new rule with an iron fist. In his eyes, John's solar panels were not an eco-friendly innovation, but a neon affront to the carefully curated visual harmony of the community. "Our neighborhood is not an exhibition hall for modern contraptions," Mike proclaimed at the next HOA meeting, his voice echoing through the sterile meeting room like a tolling bell of doom. His words, though meant to invoke order, only served to underscore the absurdity of the situation. The meeting itself quickly descended into a scene of surreal absurdity. Members of the board, each armed with their own pedantic interpretations of the rules, began to bicker over minutiae that would have seemed laughable if not for the seriousness with which they were discussed. The color of the mounting frames for the solar panels, for example, became a hotly debated issue. Some argued that a matte black finish clashed with the pastel aesthetics of the community, while others insisted that a brushed aluminum look was too avant-garde. The debate soon escalated into a full-blown farce, with each member hurling exaggerated insults and snide remarks that painted the meeting as much a stage for theatrical performance as a forum for governance. Midway through this comedic charade, an unexpected twist sent shockwaves through the already fraught atmosphere. David, previously considered the HOA's voice of reason and eternal neutral party, suddenly stood up. In a move that left the room in stunned silence, David declared, "Perhaps we should ask ourselves, are we here to preserve aesthetics or to stifle progress and innovation?" His tone was both incredulous and cutting, as if he were exposing the very hypocrisy that had defined the board's actions. For a moment, the laughter died, replaced by a palpable tension as the assembled members realized that their rigid adherence to absurd rules might be crumbling under the weight of their own pettiness. The shock of David's outburst was only matched by its comic timing. As he continued, his words took on a satirical lilt. "I mean, if we outlaw solar panels because they don't conform to our artistic vision, what's next? A ban on neon bicycles for disturbing the night's natural glow? Or perhaps we should start rating our neighbors based on the aesthetic quality of their lawn ornaments." His quip drew a ripple of reluctant chuckles from a few board members, and even Mike's stern expression faltered for a split second. In that moment, it became clear that the board was not immune to the ridicule it so readily imposed on others, a fact that John found both deliciously ironic and immensely satisfying. Despite the brief lapse in decorum, the meeting soon resumed its farcical proceedings. Mike, regaining his composure, announced that the board had unanimously agreed to implement the new regulations immediately. The rules were as arbitrary as they were draconian, with specific guidelines about acceptable frame colors, installation angles, and even the reflective properties of the panels. It was as if the board had decided that every aspect of John's solar installation was an opportunity to micromanage and critique. To add insult to injury, they proposed a series of aesthetic audits for every homeowner, an idea so ludicrous that it could only be described as bureaucratic overreach at its finest. Throughout the meeting, John listened with a mixture of amusement and simmering indignation. His mind raced with ideas for retaliation, each more creative than the last. The board's obsession with minutiae and their refusal to embrace progress only fueled his determination to fight back. In his eyes, their petty squabbles were nothing more than a pathetic attempt to cling to an outdated way of thinking, a way of thinking that needed to be demolished brick by brick. With every jab thrown at his solar panels, John's resolve hardened. He was not simply defending his right to harness the sun's energy, he was standing up against an institution that valued conformity over common sense. As the meeting drew to a close, the atmosphere was charged with an undercurrent of impending revolution. Neighbors who had once cheered John's solar aspirations now whispered excitedly among themselves about the board's hypocrisy and the potential for a humorous yet potent act of rebellion. John's supporters saw the board's actions as an invitation, a challenge to expose the absurdity of their rules in a way that was as cutting as it was entertaining. After all, there was something inherently comical about a group of self-important officials dictating the nuances of aesthetic perfection while ignoring the very real benefits of renewable energy. In the days following the contentious meeting, John began to strategize his next moves. He combed through the HOA rulebook with the meticulousness of a detective on the trail of a scandal, uncovering clauses that were so archaic and contradictory that they offered ample ammunition for his cause. The discovery of one particular clause, which stated that any modification to the external appearance of a house that altered the reflection of natural light was forbidden, was a moment of dark humor for John. It was as if the board had managed to criminalize the very essence of nature's beauty. John could hardly contain his laughter at the irony, his mind already racing with plans to use this absurdity as a weapon in his looming revenge. The board's determination to maintain a sterile, uniform appearance in the neighborhood had inadvertently become its own undoing. As whispers of dissent grew louder among the residents, even some of the most ardent supporters of the HOA began to question whether their beloved rules were truly serving the community or merely stifling creativity and progress. In hushed conversations over backyard barbecues and garden parties, neighbors exchanged knowing looks and wry smiles, aware that they were witnessing a classic case of bureaucratic hubris about to be toppled by one man's stubborn defiance. John had spent sleepless nights plotting his revenge, a plan so audacious and ingenious that it could only be born from the twin fires of righteous indignation and a wicked sense of humor. No longer content with silently enduring the HOA's petty restrictions, he transformed his modest rooftop into a dazzling stage of defiance. His vision was nothing short of a mobile energy hub, a setup that combined state-of-the-art solar panels with an array of LED lights and a sound system that would soon shake the very foundations of the HOA's sterile meeting rooms. In the weeks leading up to the next HOA meeting, John set to work with the meticulous enthusiasm of an inventor on a mission. Every day after work, he could be seen atop his house, hammering, wiring, and configuring his new contraption. Neighbors, who once regarded him with a mix of bemusement and mild concern, now gathered at a safe distance to watch his transformation. Is he building a spaceship or just a light show? Sarah joked to David as a particularly bright LED blinked in the fading light of dusk. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and a good dose of irreverent amusement. John's device wasn't just any light show. He had integrated a sound system synchronized with the LED display, all powered by the solar panels that had once been the subject of the HOA's derision. His plan was brilliantly simple. During the next HOA meeting, as Mike and the board prattled on about aesthetic integrity and the sanctity of uniform design, John would hijack the proceedings with a spectacular show that blended technology, art, and a healthy dose of sarcasm. The night before the meeting, John double-checked every connection, every programming code, and every sequence of lights. He rehearsed the opening announcement in front of his mirror, his voice a mix of cheeky bravado and sincere excitement. "Tonight, you'll see how progress can literally light up a room," he whispered to himself, grinning at the thought of Mike's inevitable fluster. His device was programmed not only to create a mesmerizing visual spectacle but also to deliver a series of pointed messages, snippets of video evidence highlighting the HOA's own ridiculous rule violations, seamlessly intercut with humorous commentary. The following evening, the community center was abuzz with tension and anticipation as members of the HOA gathered for their routine meeting. The room, usually filled with stifled murmurs and the drone of bureaucratic chatter, now carried an undercurrent of expectation. Mike, resplendent in his formal attire and with a clipboard clutched in hand, took his place at the head of the table, his expression as stern as ever. Unbeknownst to him, however, the stage was set for a coup de theater unlike any he had ever encountered. As the meeting began, the usual litany of complaints about minor infractions and adherence to the letter of the law echoed through the room. Just as Mike droned on about the necessity of maintaining neighborhood harmony and uniform aesthetics, John, who had secretly requested a few minutes to speak, stepped forward. With a confident smile, he announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to witness the dawn of a new era in home energy and artistic expression." At that very moment, the lights in the room flickered and dimmed. A dramatic hush fell over the assembled board members, and all eyes shifted to the large projector screen that John had arranged to connect to his rooftop system via a secure wireless link. In a burst of vibrant color and rhythmic pulses, the LED lights from John's rooftop exploded into life, transforming the mundane meeting room into a pulsating dance of light and sound. The display was synchronized perfectly with a catchy, tongue-in-cheek soundtrack, a medley of remixed sound bites taken directly from previous HOA meetings, overlaid with sarcastic commentary about the tyranny of triviality. Mike's face turned a shade of crimson that rivaled the most dramatic sunset. He stammered, attempting to regain control of the situation, while other board members exchanged incredulous glances and awkward smiles. The light show, however, was just the opening act. As the visuals continued to swirl, a series of video clips began to play. They showed past HOA meetings where the board had enforced absurd rules with all the pomp and circumstance of a circus ringmaster, footage of debates over the precise hue of permissible garden gnomes, and the scandalous, unauthorized placement of a single, slightly out-of-place flower pot. John's voice, recorded in a calm yet cutting tone, narrated the clips. Here we see the great custodians of conformity in their natural habitat, diligently policing the aesthetics of a community that seems to have forgotten the meaning of creativity. The audience, initially shocked, gradually erupted into laughter and applause. Even a few of the most fervent HOA supporters couldn't help but chuckle at the undeniable absurdity of the scenes unfolding on the screen. But John wasn't finished. As the final segment of the light show began, the LED display shifted to show a montage of highlighted violations from the very rulebook that Mike and his cronies clung to so desperately. Using the same system of humor and irony, John had compiled digital evidence of the board's own breaches, instances where their actions flagrantly contradicted the spirit, and sometimes even the wording of their own regulations. One clip, in particular, showed a board member enthusiastically congratulating himself for enforcing a rule that he had ironically broken just days earlier. Another featured a candid moment when the board's prized aesthetic audit degenerated into a farce, with members critiquing the vibrancy of a sunset as if it were an art installation gone awry. As the room filled with a mixture of uproarious laughter and stunned silence, Mike attempted to regain control, his voice trembling as he demanded that the lights be turned off and the presentation halted. But it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable, the satire too sharp, and the moment too perfect. John's meticulously planned spectacle had not only embarrassed the board but also exposed the fundamental contradictions in their entire system. In a final, dramatic flourish, the light show ended with a bold message emblazoned across the screen. Progress cannot be contained by outdated rules. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, the gravity of John's statement sinking in amidst the residual glow of the LED display. Then, as if on cue, the room burst into a cacophony of cheers, claps, and even a few impromptu whistles. Neighbors, once hesitant to speak out, now found their voices, and the collective laughter seemed to wash away the oppressive weight of the board's earlier mandates. John stood at the front of the room, his face lit up not just by the LED glow but by the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. He had managed to transform what was intended to be an ordinary HOA meeting into a stage for rebellion, a spectacle that blended technology, art, and biting satire into one unforgettable act of defiance. In that moment, he wasn't just a homeowner with a penchant for solar panels. He was a revolutionary, a modern-day trickster who had outsmarted the very institution that sought to suppress him. The shock of the presentation reverberated through the room long after the lights dimmed. Members of the board exchanged nervous glances, their rigid facades crumbling as they struggled to reconcile their commitment to outdated regulations with the undeniable brilliance of John's counterattack. Even Mike, the staunch enforcer of aesthetic order, appeared visibly shaken, his authority undermined by the very evidence he had once wielded as a weapon. In the days that followed, the aftermath of the light show dominated conversations throughout the neighborhood. Social media buzzed with clips from the event, and local news outlets couldn't resist covering the revolutionary act of defiance against the HOA. John's stunt had not only earned him a reputation as the neighborhood's unlikeliest hero, but had also ignited a broader discussion about the relevance of archaic rules in a modern, innovative society. For John, the success of his counterattack was more than just a personal victory. It was a rallying cry for anyone who had ever felt oppressed by arbitrary systems of control. His rooftop transformation had demonstrated that creativity and technology, when wielded with a touch of humor and a dash of irreverence, could dismantle even the most stubborn bastions of conformity. Thus, as the HOA scrambled to salvage its reputation and Mike fumbled with plans to restore order, John continued to revel in the glow of his triumph. The light show had not only turned the tide against the board, but had also inspired a newfound sense of empowerment among his neighbors. It was a moment of poetic justice, a brilliant, luminous reminder that in the battle between progress and regulation, ingenuity and a well-timed spectacle could shine far brighter than any outdated rulebook ever could. In the days that followed John's dazzling light show, the air in the neighborhood was thick with a mix of disbelief and glee. What had begun as a solitary act of rebellion had blossomed into a full-blown community movement. The once-staid corridors of the HOA headquarters now buzzed with frantic whispers and panicked phone calls, as board members scrambled to figure out how to repair their wounded pride. It was as if the mighty fortress of bureaucracy, long built on outdated edicts and a rigid sense of aesthetic integrity, was crumbling under the relentless force of progress and humor. Mike, the erstwhile enforcer of conformity, found himself at the center of a maelstrom of criticism. No longer could he hide behind his clipboard or the cryptic clauses of the HOA rulebook. The local press, ever on the lookout for a scandal with a side of satire, descended upon the story like bees on a honeypot. Headlines splashed across community bulletins and social media platforms: Solar Rebellion, how one man's brilliance lit up more than just a roof, and from enforcement to embarrassment, the fall of the HOA's iron fist. Mike's attempts to justify the absurd restrictions were met with a barrage of sarcastic retorts, each one more cutting than the last. His public appearances became opportunities for accidental comedy as he fumbled with his notes and mumbled incoherently about maintaining community standards. Meanwhile, John continued his quiet celebration. He strolled through the neighborhood, now greeted by nods of respect and friendly waves from former skeptics and loyal supporters alike. His rooftop, bathed in the soft afterglow of his light show, stood as a gleaming monument to innovation and defiance. Neighbors began referring to him as the Green Avenger or Captain Solar, titles that John accepted with a wry smile and a twinkle in his eye. The community, once shackled by the stranglehold of arbitrary regulations, was now buzzing with new energy, a blend of eco-friendly aspirations and a shared sense of liberation. It wasn't long before the HOA board, desperate to salvage what remained of their authority, called for an emergency meeting. This time, however, the board members arrived with a palpable air of trepidation, their self-assured swagger replaced by furtive glances and stiffened postures. The meeting room, usually a sterile arena of bureaucratic drudgery, now felt charged with an undercurrent of impending reckoning. With the entire neighborhood watching via live streams and hastily arranged community gatherings, the stakes had never been higher. At the meeting, Mike attempted to deliver a speech that would restore order and reaffirm the sanctity of the HOA's rules. But his words, laden with bureaucratic jargon, fell flat as he tried to explain the necessity of aesthetic audits and regulated solar exposure. His arguments were punctuated by awkward pauses and the occasional stutter, while the assembled members exchanged barely concealed smirks. It became increasingly clear that the board's credibility was in free fall. One of the board members, in a rare moment of candor, whispered to another, "Did we just get out satirized by a guy with a bunch of solar panels?" The comment, though whispered, sent ripples of laughter through the room. Then, as if in a final act of poetic justice, John made his presence felt once again. He requested the floor, his voice calm yet tinged with mischief. "Fellow residents," he began, "tonight is not just about defending a right to harness renewable energy. It's about embracing a future where creativity and progress triumph over outdated decrees." With that, he unveiled a series of documents and digital evidence meticulously compiled over the past few weeks. These records detailed every inconsistency and contradiction within the HOA's own rulebook, instances where the board had, ironically, flouted its own regulations in pursuit of maintaining an absurd semblance of order. The evidence was damning. There were video clips of board members enthusiastically celebrating minor violations, only to be later seen contravening the very rules they had established. There were excerpts from internal emails where the board debated, with an almost farcical level of seriousness, over the correct shade of permissible solar panel frames. And then there were the audio recordings, a collection of nonsensical legal jargon delivered in tones that could only be described as tragically comical. With each revelation, the room erupted in a mix of laughter and applause. Even some of the most die-hard supporters of the HOA couldn't help but see the sheer ridiculousness of it all. By the time John finished his presentation, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. The board members, now red-faced and visibly shaken, had no choice but to acknowledge the overwhelming support for change. Under mounting pressure from the community and the ever-watchful eyes of local media, the HOA board was forced to concede. In a move that was as much a public relations exercise as it was an admission of defeat, they agreed to overhaul the draconian regulations that had sparked the entire debacle. The rules were rewritten to be more accommodating of modern technologies, and for the first time in memory, the community was allowed the freedom to pursue sustainable energy solutions without fear of bureaucratic retribution. Yet the final twist in this tale of revenge and redemption was one that no one could have anticipated. A few weeks later, as the dust began to settle and the community started to embrace the new era of progress, an unexpected announcement came from the HOA headquarters itself. In a move that left even John momentarily speechless, the board declared that they would be installing solar panels on their own building. The decision was framed as a gesture of unity with modernity and a symbolic step toward a greener, more progressive future. The irony was not lost on the residents, who saw this as the ultimate punchline in a long-running joke. The very institution that had once sought to suppress innovation was now, by its own admission, embracing it, if only to save face and mend its fractured reputation. In the grand finale of the suburban saga, the HOA's decision to adopt solar power became a powerful symbol of the transformative power of creativity and collective will. The new panels, gleaming under the same sun that had fueled John's revolution, served as a permanent reminder that progress cannot be contained by outdated rules and petty regulations. They stood as a beacon of hope and a testament to the idea that when a community comes together, even the most entrenched systems can be overthrown, often with a hearty dose of laughter and a touch of irreverence. As the sun set on this dramatic chapter, the neighborhood was forever changed. John's triumph had ignited a spirit of innovation and defiance that spread far beyond the confines of a single dispute. The story of the solar panels, the ludicrous memos, and the eventual metamorphosis of the HOA became legend. A tale recounted at backyard barbecues, local cafes, and community meetings for years to come. It was a story not just of technological advancement, but of the power of humor and resilience in the face of rigid conformity. In a final, resounding twist, even Mike, once the stern guardian of aesthetics, found himself reluctantly admiring the shift. Stripped of his former authority and now merely a footnote in the annals of HOA history, he was seen making awkward attempts to adapt to the new norms, often glancing at the solar-powered board with a mixture of regret and begrudging admiration. It was as if the universe itself had delivered a satirical rebuke to all those who dared to cling to the past at the expense of progress. Thus, as laughter echoed through the halls of both homes and the newly modernized HOA office, it became abundantly clear that creativity had indeed triumphed over bureaucracy. The solar panels weren't just devices for harnessing energy. They had become instruments of change, shining a light on the absurdities of a bygone era and heralding a future where innovation and humor walked hand in hand. And so, with the community united and the spirit of rebellion firmly entrenched, John's revenge story came full circle, a radiant, triumphant testament to the idea that progress, much like the sun itself, always rises again.